Welcome to Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. We're glad that you have chosen to join us once again today as we continue this incredible journey through the book of Mark, a fascinating book, and we're learning more and more about Jesus day by day as we study it. This week, lesson number 6, Inside Out. Well, what's this lesson about? We're about to find out, but let's start with prayer. Father, we thank you for giving us this incredible opportunity to take this journey through the book of Mark and to learn more about you, to learn more about your plan for our lives as we do so. We ask that you will bless us, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're happy to have with us once again also the author of this quarter's Sabbath School lesson, that is Tom Shepherd. He is the Senior Research Professor of New Testament at the Theological Seminary at Andrews University. Tom, welcome back once again.
Good to be with you.
So Inside Out, lesson number 6. We've worked our way through the first several chapters of the book of Mark. We're now on, I think, chapter 7, give or take. And Inside Out, let me ask this question as we dive into it. The Pharisees were a little bit upset with the disciples as we get into chapter 7 here. They didn't wash their hands. Now, I've heard of parents who are upset with their kids when they don't wash their hands, but this seems like it's a little deeper issue than a mere not washing away of the germs. What's going on in this story?
Well, I can just imagine somebody studying this with young people at the church, and the children coming home and saying, we don't have to wash our hands. Jesus said so. And pretty soon the pastor or somebody would be getting a phone call. What are you doing telling our children not to wash their hands? You're right, Eric, that it's not about hygiene that we're discussing here. It's again about ritual purity. And the disciples didn't do the ritual kind of washing that the Pharisees followed. And so it's interesting to notice here as well, whenever it's the disciples that are doing something they don't like, they complain to Jesus. And whenever it's Jesus who's doing something they don't like, they complain to the disciples. They don't go straight to the individual involved. So here they're talking about this ritual purity. And so the way that this progresses then is that the Pharisees and the scribes ask in verse 5, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? Notice this is actually not something from the Old Testament. This is a tradition that was established between the Testaments. It says, but they eat with defiled hands, with unwashed hands. So how is Jesus going to respond to this? Well, the interesting thing is, in these conflicts, it's kind of tit for tat, and it's not like they're asking, could you really explain to us what it means? Do we really need to wash our hands? When they attack him, he responds with a complaint against them. He says in verse 6, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. Right? So there, right away, you see there's the commandments of God, that's the Old Testament, regulations, and the traditions of men. And he puts the two of them on the opposite side of the fence. Yeah.
So they're upset that he's not following these traditions. As we work our way down through this story, we get to verse number 11 in this concept or idea of Corban. Mm-hmm. How does that fit into this story and what's going on here?
Yeah, so you got to get the whole context here. If you start in verse 9, he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God, now so notice the commandment of God, in order to establish your tradition. So that's the traditions of men. For, here comes the commandment of God, verse 10, Moses said, honor your father and your mother. Of course, that's the 5th commandment of the Decalogue. And whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. There was a death penalty involved. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do. So how did this work? Okay, so if a Jew said over any kind of property thing that this is Corban, That means it was dedicated to God. It was dedicated to the temple. Now, they had this interesting way. The fifth commandment says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. That's not just about saying nice things about mom and dad. That's about actually taking care of them when they're old. There was no Social Security program, and so your children were actually your Social Security, and they would take care of you when you got old. So some people maybe didn't want to do that from selfish reasons, and so you could have a situation where a man would say to his father, anything that you would profit from me is Corban. So he doesn't really give it to the temple. It's if he were to give it to his parent, it would be Corban, so he couldn't give it to his parent because it was dedicated to God. So you can see the hypocrisy in this. It's just painful in that you would say, Dad, I wish I could help you, but anything that I would give to you, I've already dedicated it to God. He's not going to the temple. He's keeping it, and he just doesn't want to help them. And Jesus rightly said, that is just rank hypocrisy, that you would actually try to hide your selfishness under a cloak, a supposed cloak of dedication to God. It's not dedication to God, it's dedication to yourself. So Jesus is pretty strong here, when he's, you call somebody a hypocrite, that's tough language. That's strong language.
It is. So he's being pretty straight and calling out some of the stuff that they've been doing. We get down to verse 15, and there's a riddle. I guess you could call it a riddle that Jesus gives us in verse 15. I'll read verse 15, and then maybe you can comment on it.
Sure.
Jesus says, there is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. Now, there are some who would perhaps take this in a slightly different way than I think you and I are probably going to take it. Mm-hmm. But unpack this a little bit for us and help us to understand it from a biblical perspective.
Well, you know what? The disciples had trouble understanding this. And when they go into the house, in verse 17, when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. That's that word, paraboli, and this really illustrates it. Obviously, verse 15 is a riddle. How is it there's nothing that goes in and comes out and so forth? So then Jesus kind of knocks them around a bit. Are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters into not his heart but his stomach and is expelled? Actually, it's a little more
agricultural
language. Yeah, when it expelled, it means it goes into the latrine. Okay, so that's actually what it says in Greek. And then there's this little parenthetical statement, thus he declared all food clean. Now, a lot of people take that to mean that Jesus did away with the difference between clean and unclean foods that the Old Testament describes. That's actually not the case. First of all, when it says, thus he declared all foods clean, actually in Greek it doesn't say quite that much. It's more like this: since it enters, verse 19, since it enters the heart, does not enter his heart but his stomach, and is expelled, cleansing all foods. Now, cleansing all foods is probably a parenthetical statement that the gospel writer is explaining what Jesus is talking about, right? So translating it, thus he declared all foods clean, is appropriate way to translate it. But people have misunderstood what that means. The things that Jesus has been railing against are the traditions of men. It would be really strange here for him now to attack Moses' statements by saying, it doesn't matter. You can eat pork, it's okay. You can, eat all those things that you used to think of. Instead, what he's still doing is he's still attacking the traditions of men. They had this thing of touch defilement. So if you touch something that's unclean, that makes you unclean. Now, if you touch something else, that makes that unclean. It's like different levels of uncleanness you pass on. Jesus is like, remember, they started off with you didn't wash your hands the right way. Jesus is doing away with touch defilement, which wasn't an Old Testament law, but was rather something that they had in their traditions that they had built up. So he does away with that. Now, to us today, that might seem like a small matter, but actually, this created an incredible change because it meant that Gentiles and Jews could eat together, because they couldn't eat together because of the defilement issues and different things. And when he did away with touch defilement, it said that, okay, Jews and Gentiles can work together, they can eat together, they can be in the church together, they can be brothers and sisters. And while it may seem small and sort of, to us, sort of like washing your hands with, a small issue, this really created the possibility for union within the church. Now, some people, like I say, have taken it the wrong way to suggest that he's, doing away with this kind of thing, of the commandments of God. When you read the rest of it, where what Jesus describes what it is that makes a person unclean, that's important to talk about, because often people miss that because all they want to talk about is unclean foods. You go down to verse 20, and he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Actually, if you take a look at it, he has all of the last half of the Decalogue in that list. Honoring your parents, well, what's back in verse 10. Murder is described in verse 21, so is adultery, so is theft. Deceit is the 9th commandment, is in verse 22, and so is covetousness, the 10th commandment, in verse 22. And since he describes, he just started with the worship of God, in vain you worship, he's actually affirming the 10 commandments throughout this passage and doing away with the human tradition. When you see it in that light, the whole thing fits together perfectly. One of my students, this was his doctoral dissertation. The external examiner, not an Adventist, but a famous gospel scholar came, and she said, at the beginning of his defense, I'm going to have to change the way I teach this passage. He convinced her with his good dissertation. So it was really quite impressive.
So it clearly means something else when you take it in context and look at everything that's in there. Yeah. Now, if we're wanting to dig more deeply, we do have the companion book. Tell us a little bit about the companion book and what's in this chapter that people might be interested in.
Yeah, the companion book goes right along with the Sabbath school lesson. All of the chapters are numbered just like and they have the same titles, so it's easy to find the chapter that you're dealing with. Well, this one really lays out all of those commandments that are listed there. It goes on to talk about the challenge of verse 19 and what it means. It talks about the woman with the Syrophoenician woman. We're going to study a little bit more about her. So it gives you additional information that goes beyond the lessons. Well worth getting.
And you can pick that up for yourself at itiswritten.shop. Again, itiswritten.shop. Just look for the book on the Gospel of Mark. It's the companion book to this quarter's Sabbath School study by Thomas Shepard. And we are looking forward to having you back again in just a moment as we continue looking at this concept of inside out here on lesson number 6 as we study through the book of Mark. We'll be back in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Dr. David DeRose, a specialist in internal medicine and preventive medicine. And I've been surprised over the years in working with patients and studying the medical research literature just how powerful hemorrheology is when it comes to health. You may be wondering, what is hemorrheology? Well, I call it the Methuselah factor, and that's the title of my book. The Methuselah factor really helps you connect with things that can help your blood be more fluid. You say, why is that important? It's important because it can help you decrease your risk of a stroke or a heart attack, even lower your risk of cancer. But it's a whole lot more than just preventing killer diseases. If you improve your blood fluidity, your mind will work better, you'll perform physically better, and you'll decrease your risk of dementia. So don't hesitate. Dive into the Methuselah factor. Make a difference in your life and the life of those that you love.
Welcome back to Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. We are looking at lesson number 6 in our 13-lesson study on the book of Mark. Inside Out is what we're looking at this week. Tom, we've been talking about what contaminates a person, or at least from the Jewish leaders' viewpoint versus what Jesus was teaching, what is it that really does contaminate a person?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the story of these, how they were talking about his defilement for not washing their hands, that was on the outside. When Jesus said, with his little riddle, that it's what comes from inside that defiles the person. And we finished up by talking about all the commandments that show up here and that really affirm the teaching that Jesus is supporting Moses. Actually, all through the Gospel of Mark, whenever Jesus talks about Moses, he's positive about Moses. He gives these positive statements, and here he's supporting the Ten Commandments. So you can't hardly be more positive about that. So,
very good. Now we go from that story to another story, and this story has it's kind of confused some people along the way about why Jesus would talk to this woman in such a manner. It's the story of the Syrophoenician woman. Walk us through this story and what's going on here. Why does Jesus appear to address this woman in the way that he does? There's something under the surface here, but let's walk through it.
Yeah, so this is one of those rare times when Jesus goes outside of the land of Judea or Galilee. He goes up to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and it says in verse 24, he enters a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. This is again that secrecy revelation thing. And so there's this woman, immediately, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now, he's inside a house, it's important, and she comes and she falls down at his feet. And that's important too, as we'll see as the story progresses, okay? So she comes in and she begs him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, in most of the stories, when somebody comes and asks Jesus for help, immediately he helps them. Now, we find a few experiences where he asks people questions and everything. But the truth of the matter is, throughout the Gospels, and I'd like our listeners to really recognize this, anybody who comes to Jesus for help always gets it. Anybody who comes to Jesus for help always gets it. Now, people who come to argue with him typically lose. So it's not good to argue with Jesus, but anybody who comes for help gets help. Now, this story is a little odd in that regard. She asked him for help, and he said to her in verse 27, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." I used to teach a class on world religions, and I would have visitors come. Students love the visitors. And I used to have a Jewish rabbi come and talk to the students, talk about Judaism, what was special to him about Judaism, and so forth. And I would allow the students to ask questions. Now, eventually I learned that I needed to teach the students how to ask questions. Because I had a student one time ask this rabbi, "Why don't you believe in Jesus?" A pretty confrontational kind of question to ask a rabbi. The rabbi referred to this passage. He said, Jesus called a woman a dog. Now, you know, even in that day and even today, to call somebody a dog is that's a real put down. All right, so how would we answer this rabbi who said he didn't believe in Jesus because he called this woman a dog? And that's a pretty serious kind of accusation. You have to look at this passage a little bit more carefully to see the answer to that. First of all, he says, let the children be fed first. That first implies a second that's going to come. For it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, in the setting, Jesus is in a house. The woman is bowed before him. He's describing the children's bread. They're going to give it to the dogs who are inside the house, maybe under the table. So there's a clear kind of representation here that what he's talking about is what the woman sees is going on. So these dogs were dogs that were inside the house. They were not outside dogs. So there's already a sense of they're part of the family. And this idea of feed the children first implies, all right, that's not the only people who will be fed. In fact, in the Gospels, actually we go to the book of Romans, people don't often recognize this, but Paul says that the gospel news, if you go over to Romans chapter 1, you find that Paul says that the gospel message, he says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God," is Romans 1:16, is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Okay? So Paul is following Jesus here. Let the children be fed first. All right? So there was a gospel order. We kind of think, well, that can't be right. Everybody's equal. Well, they are the chosen people. All right? So Jesus is saying that the children will be fed first, but that means that the Gentiles will be fed too. Calling her a dog isn't the same as saying, she's just worthless. She's inside the house. She's part of the family that's there together. And she recognizes it. She calls on him to let her have that kind of relationship, and he agrees. So that's really a response to that kind of argument. It's a little in your face, if we might say, that Jesus would say such a thing, but it actually taught that the Gentiles were to be included, just like the Jews. Now, our earliest manuscript of the Gospel of Mark is Papyrus 45, comes from the 3rd century AD. And it doesn't have the yes. It just says Lord. Now, if you think about that for a moment, which is more respectful? Yes, Lord? Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs, let's see, where am I? Yeah, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's bread, crumbs. Or would it be, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs? Which one is more respectful? Probably the yes, Lord.
It seems the yes, Lord, because there's an agreement there.
Yeah, you're agreeing with her. But when she doesn't say yes, when she just says Lord, she's kind of, she's confronting him, She's confronting him a bit. She's arguing with him. That's probably what the original was. Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So she's arguing with Jesus. Now, this is the only person in the Gospels who argues with Jesus and wins. But he wanted her to win. He gave her clues that she should keep on pressing by saying the children first, and then making the metaphor clear that the dogs who were let into the house are allowed. Now, her statement is really interesting because she says, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She's asking him to heal her daughter of a demon possession, which is a big miracle, but she's calling it just a crumb. So she's actually elevating him, and she's saying all she's asking for is just a little bit of his mercy. And of course, he shows his mercy. He says, for this statement you may go, the demon has left your daughter. It's a beautiful story in that sense. Now, this is an illustration of that inside out, of the person now, he's breaking down the walls of prejudice. So the previous story talked about how Gentiles and Jews could come together, and here he is illustrating that that's possible for that to happen.
So it just the thought carries down through.
Carries it through. Mm-hmm.
Not random stories, but a connection between them. Mm-hmm. As we're walking down through the book of Mark, we're getting now to chapter 8. Mm-hmm. And I noticed in the study, in the quarterly, there's a significant story at the beginning of chapter 8 that really doesn't get mentioned.
It doesn't get mentioned
in the study guide.
Right.
Any particular reason why?
Okay, so when I wrote the Sabbath School Quarterly, they gave me very strict kind of word limits of what you could talk about, and there's only 13 lessons for covering 16 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. So there really wasn't enough space to cover everything. I had to make choices. And so I left out the important story of the feeding of the 4,000 that's at the beginning of chapter 8. Now, if you want to get that story, then what you need to do is buy the commentary that's going to be coming out. There's a new series of commentaries, the Seventh-day Adventist International Bible Commentary. 3 of the volumes have already been published, and Pacific Press is planning to publish probably several volumes each year now until we're done. We've been working on this project since 2011, It's a series of Adventist scholars from around the world. That's why it's called International Bible Commentary. And they're doing very careful work to make a good presentation to be very helpful to the church. If you enjoyed the old commentary series, you're going to enjoy this one even more because it's got a lot more depth, a lot more information, a lot more commentary in all portions of the Scripture. So well worth getting. Now most people when they read a commentary, they don't read it all the way through. They're looking for a particular text and they got a question. So you'll find that in this new series.
So 3 volumes already out.
Yeah.
And more coming.
Yep, and they're
soon.
available from the ABC.
Very, very good. All right, so we kind of skipped through that because of time or space purposes or reasons. We get down a little bit later in chapter 8, and the Pharisees ask Jesus for a sign. Maybe you have once or twice asked Jesus for a sign or know somebody who asked Jesus for a sign. The Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign, and he doesn't give them one. Why not?
Right. The Pharisees came, began to argue with him, verse 11, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." He left them, got in the boat again, went to the other side. So they'd already had the signs. They had already had plenty of demonstrations of his power, of his miracles. And they just want more. It's really reminiscent of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man in hell says, "Oh, send raise Lazarus from the dead." And Jesus says, Abraham answers him, "Look, if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they wouldn't listen to somebody even if he was raised from the dead." And you know what? Somebody named Lazarus was raised from the dead, and they plan to kill him too. That's described in the Gospel of John. So he doesn't give them a sign because a sign wouldn't make any difference to them. Now, do we ask signs of God? Well, sometimes we may ask God for a sign to show us, and he does promise to lead us. And sometimes he'll give us a providential sign that shows us the way. So it's not wrong to ask for a sign, but not in the way that they were. It was hypocrites asking for more proof that they didn't want to believe anyways.
And they didn't need any more evidence.
No.
Plenty was given.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we hope that this week's study has been a blessing to you as we have gone through it, and hopefully it's helped to clarify a few things in your mind, and now you can share those clarifications with others to encourage them in their walk. We look forward to seeing you again next time when you join us here on Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written.